Hi everyone, it's me, Tim. Today I want to talk about how did the internet change game development? This was a question from Ozanku Bonoglu 812. I hope I got that number right. Who said, who asked, how did the internet change game development and the game industry in general? I remember you saying CD stories about the disc not working and that you made a lot of buggy games. So how would Vampire Arcanum be coming out today? Or in what aspects are we better or worse? Good questions. And Ozanku Banaglu, I apologize since you are a master channel member. You asked this question a few days ago, but life intervened and I couldn't have time to make a video. So it's Wednesday. So I'm doing this video, but Thursday and Friday I've already unlocked. So I'll post it in place of Monday, which you will see on Saturday. There we go. So let's talk about how the internet changed game development. And I will start off by saying I was there at the internet at the very beginning. I've mentioned this before. I've talked about, I was on the internet when it was called ARPANET. I was one of the original people arguing Picard versus Kirk. I was, talking about Star Wars. I remember talking about the book Empire of the East by Fred Saberhagen online in the late 80s. So, yeah. And since I'm basically going to jump right in to the last part of that question about what's better or worse, and I'll touch upon how I think this would have affected my games. So let's talk about the pros first. So how did the rise of the internet change game development for the better? The biggest thing, game development got a lot easier. And I mean, not just easier, but the barrier to entry also got lower. So I've talked about how game engines did that, but the internet itself made it a lot easier to learn and get into the game industry. First of all, when I got into game development, you had to learn it all on your own. And there was very few things out there other than some technical manuals. I mean, really technical, like with schematics, like chip schematics and memory locations that you could peek and poke into. Now, just on YouTube, you can watch hundreds, if not thousands of videos. How to use Unity, how to code pathing, how to animate a character. It's all there. And you can just watch someone do it, explain it to you step by step. You can back up and watch it again. It's never been easier to learn game development. And then it's easier to find other game developers. It's easy to apply to companies. You can just go to their website and apply. We had to buy game magazines and look up their address on their ads, the lucky ones that did do that. Most game companies put their address in the ad, and then you just send them a letter and hope someone read it and sent it to the right department and you heard something back. Or if you just want to work with other game developers, if you're solo or you just want to do game jams, it's so much easier to do that now. Similarly, it's much easier to get feedback from the people playing your game. In the 80s and 90s, early 90s, you'd send out a game and the only feedback you got were from professional reviewers, and the occasional, I guess, letter to the editor in something like Computer Gaming World. But it was hard to figure out, like, what did people really like this game and what did they like? Just hearing back, your game's a success, you sold this many units, doesn't tell you what you did right and what you did wrong. And remember, I really think you learn a lot more by failure than by success. Early access games are something that the internet's allowed to happen, where you can release your game and tell your fans, this is an alpha. We've got everything in. We haven't debugged it. We haven't balanced it yet. But what do you think of the features? Because now is the time we could change them. That's a huge, huge change to what we used to have, where you basically... The only thing close to that was when we released a demo and people would comment on the demo. And you could maybe apply that, but often just being put on a disc or a CD in a magazine and waiting for the magazine to come out, months would go by. So by the time you heard any feedback, you're like, well, those features are locked in stone now. World releases are way easier now. It used to be a problem back then when there was actual physical discs that you had to ship out. So trying to coordinate a release in a dozen countries, wow. I mean, I'm not even talking getting it localized, getting the language changed and getting art changed how you have to in some countries. I'm talking about just trying to coordinate a worldwide release. Similarly with patching, which is something that came up, Troika released some buggy games. Patching got easier once the internet was around. It used to be if you wanted your game patched, you'd have to mail in your old disc and then wait for it to come back. And the reason they made you mail it is you couldn't just write them and say, "Hey, it's buggy, send me a new disc," because then they'd be sending discs to people who never bought it. So you sent in your old disc, and you got sent a new one with the patch stuff on it. Much easier to release patches on the internet, especially Delta patches that would apply themselves to the executable. So if you hadn't bought the game, the Delta patch did nothing for you. There was nothing to Delta. So at least that helped. And DLCs were the same thing. DLCs back then were a major deal, and the reason they didn't exist as much is shipping a DLC physically meant you had to guarantee a certain minimum number of sales, or it did not make any sense to have DLC. Now, if your game's even a modicum of success, you can do DLC because it's digitally distributed. And so you don't realize it now, but as game players, you're getting a lot more patches and DLCs than you ever got back in the 80s and 90s. And then piracy. Piracy was a lot... The rise of internet made piracy easier, but that's when people started introducing online checks. So you'd put in your disc and it would check it against a registry and go, okay, you're allowed to play the game. So it did reduce piracy when the internet came out. It both increased it and decreased it. I'm going to call that a pro. So, but on the notes of piracy, now let's talk about the cons. What bad things did the internet cause to the game industry? Piracy. Let's talk about that again. Sure, piracy may have gone down overall, but that was because measures got taken to stop piracy, which had gone up in the early parts because people would just copy the disc and share it online. This, I believe, you could for someone smarter than me could probably work out the direct connections between the reduction in piracy and the rise in subscription-based games. Because you can't pirate a subscription-based game. When you go to play it, it checks to see if your subscription is valid. So, and they can even check to make sure only one person's playing it at a time for that subscription. So even if you shared your subscription game with other people and all your subscription information, you both can't play it at the same time. And it's going to mix your achievements and all that. So most people don't do it. So piracy went down, but subscription went up. And that led to games as a service, which I know a lot of you don't like, and I'm not a huge fan of myself, but that was a direct result of the internet. We could do games as a service because we had this internet to provide the service over. Also, a lot of the pros I mentioned earlier led to games being released in a bad state. Because patching is easier, because you can do early access tests, a lot of games get released super buggy, super unbalanced, because they know they can either call it an early access and people will pay for it, and then you fix it, and then it's basically you're releasing a game that's buggy and then you're patching it. Or games just go out buggy and I'll be able to patch it. Console games especially used to have to be rigorously tested because you could not patch them easily. People would have to send in their CD or their cartridge, and then you'd have to send them a new one, and that was expensive and slow. So it was hard to do. Now, with digital patching, just release the game. We'll patch it later, and they're getting an update that morning, the morning the patch goes out. So that's led to games being released in bad states. Also, because things went digital, because of the internet, boxes and manuals became far less important. Sure, you could release the art, and people might see it on the Steam store when they're buying, or a splash screen in the game, but there's no box to hold in your hand and really cool things to look at and read, and there's no cool manual to read. I've seen games that ship now with a little how to play 4-page text file. We really made some really cool manuals for Fallout and for Arcanum and Temple, and I don't see those very much anymore, and the internet and digital distribution is directly to blame. Another thing the internet has caused is they've always existed, but vocal minorities now are much louder, and you will frequently see a game go out and there's complaints made about it, and it sounds like a lot of people are having this complaint, but it turns out while thousands of people are playing and enjoying the game, there's maybe 100 who are complaining about something in it that those thousands don't care about. And sometimes that ratio is a lot bigger. Maybe there's 10,000 or 100,000 people enjoying a game. It's fun, but you have these, 20 or 30 people just yelling very loudly about something they don't like. And it's weird. It's hard to get a measure of, do people really like this? Because a lot of people are playing it. We're getting really good, feedback on Steam or GOG or however you digitally distribute it. But then there are these sites coming up going, this is bad and we hate this and you're like, it's hard to figure out, is this really a big problem or is it a small problem being spoken of loudly? And then similarly, this is something that's always been true. You can't make everybody happy. You just can't. And I've talked about no matter what design feature you come up with, there's people who love it and people who hate it. And if you try to give them both features, there's people who love that you gave both and people who hate that you gave both, and go, just make up your mind, you wishy-washy designer. So you can't make everyone happy, which you've always known, but the internet means you hear everyone, whether they're happy or not. And the happy people tend to be playing the game. So you hear a disproportionate amount of the unhappy people, which makes you feel like you're not making, you're not making everyone happy, but it feels like you're making more people unhappy than you're making happy. And that's just the nature of the internet. I think that's most of what I could think. Overall, I think the internet has been a good thing for games. Overall. But those cons stick out and they're tough to deal with. It's the same thing social media has. Social media has some good stuff, has some bad stuff. I mean, I stopped using it for 7 years. I went off social media from 2016 to 2023. I'd had enough. But then also my life seemed better. But yeah, you lose contact with some people and there's pros and cons to everything. So, Ozanku Banoglu, I hope that answered your question.